And now life has moved on, and people here have talked about the cycle. You know, the cycle has moved on. It was always going to move on. It's just when you're in the middle of it, you don't know when it's going to happen and what's going to cause it. But now, you know, the London whale, the JP Morgan problem, money laundering at other banks, the LIBOR rate rigging issue, you know, Goldman Sachs is no longer interesting. It's not front and center. And so, you know, brings me to the point about how I think firms should think about repairing their reputations. You know, the easy, and I have to say sadly, classic response for most of these organizations is to say, hey, we're no longer front and center. We're not under the spotlight. What we need to do is keep our heads down. Let's concentrate on doing our business. Let's crank up our CSR activities and give a bit more to charity, and we'll get by this. And I think that CSR activities and giving money to charity are very important. I think people should definitely do that. You shouldn't rely on it to resolve your reputational problems. I think that that's nuts. And I think that the opportunity that firms in the financial space have now to address the problems that they're dealing with are real, and they're very urgent. And I think there are three things, and they're structural, they are operational, and they're cultural. And I'll just very quickly go through. So, structural, there is no doubt that the legislation that's come out, Dodd-Frank and the Volcker Rule, you know, cause all sorts of unhappiness, ructions. Anybody who's involved in this will know that people will tell you in the business, these are, you know, a lot of these rules are completely crazy. The legislation doesn't make sense. It's all fantastically complicated. The Volcker Rule is completely bonkers. We really shouldn't be, you know, my point is, you know what? That train has left the station. You may be able to move things along at the margin, but right now in the center, you've got to deal with the reality. So I think two things that have come out of this that are really important and very helpful. Banks have already massively increased their capital. So they've increased their safety buffer. They have reduced their leverage. They have diversified their funding sources. And they've got out of products that were potentially very risky. All those are good things. On the capital front, they're also doing other things which are altering the way in which they think about their business. So the new rules will require banks to put much more capital into certain activities. That's good. You know, I think that society is very good at unlearning important lessons. And one of the lessons that people tend to unlearn quite quickly, it seems, in the financial services space, is the importance of having too much capital. You know, how can you possibly have too much capital? But you will get arguments from people that will almost persuade you that the too much capital argument is right. I think it's nuts, and I think that banks ought to be focused on making sure that they've got more than enough capital for anything they want to do. One positive sign out of all of this at the moment, UBS. You know, UBS, which got into all kinds of trouble, has finally decided that the new rules will make fixed income trading for them far too expensive, so they're getting out of fixed income. They announced they were firing 10,000 people. You know, that's an enormous change in the structure of the industry, and the more banks that think about what they're doing in this space, the better, I think. So the second thing here is that there is, you know, and I mentioned it in the context of Dodd-Frank and Volcker, the rhetoric coming out of financial institutions has been deafening. And I think it's really counterproductive. I think that it's counterproductive because it's making it very difficult for regulators to actually come up with sensible solutions, because the anti-bank sentiment is so strong that anytime they think about what they're doing in a really thoughtful way, they're likely to get criticized, and they themselves have got their own issues. So my recommendation is that banks dial down the rhetoric. The third thing that I think needs to happen in this space, and is critical, is addressing too big to fail. The idea that you're such an enormous bank that you can't possibly go bust, the taxpayer will have to come bail you out. You know, too big to fail simply shouldn't be allowed to exist. And I think a number of banks have taken some pretty good initiatives in this area. But my view on this is that unless banks address this issue and resolve the problem themselves, they're going to get a solution imposed on them, and I bet you they won't like it. So too big to fail, I think, really needs to be addressed. Second thing, the operational stuff. You know, there's been talk this afternoon about transparency, and so I think that banks need to be much more transparent about what they're doing.